Some mornings in Kansas arrive like a verdict.
She heard it before she saw it.
Not the sound of neighbors. Something slower. Something that had already decided. They came with clipboards and flatbeds. They never came alone. And she walked toward them anyway.
The morning the bank came for her plow, Willa Stout was already ankle-deep in mud, coaxing a rusted seed drill through ground that refused to cooperate with the season. The earth of Granger's Bluff County smelled of snowmelt and old roots, the particular cold, wet smell of Kansas in early March, when the land looked like it might become something again, but hadn't decided yet. Willa had been out since before first light, working by feel more than sight, her breath coming in small white bursts that vanished the moment they left her lips. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Not a farm wagon. The sound was wrong, too deliberate, too unhurried, the kind of pace that belonged to a man who had nowhere urgent to be because the outcome was already settled. She straightened one hand on the drill handle and watched the road. Two vehicles turned onto Red Wing Road. The first was a heavy flatbed pulled by a team of grays. The second was a buggy, black and neat, the kind that bankers and undertakers favored because both professions required an appearance of respectability at moments when respectability was the last thing anyone felt. 3 men rode in the flatbed's bench seat. One man sat alone in the buggy, holding the reins with the loose confidence of someone who had made this trip before. Willa set down the drill handle. She pulled off her right glove, tucked it into her coat pocket, and walked toward the gate. Her boots sucked and released with each step, the mud doing its best to hold her in place. She reached the fence line just as the flatbed stopped and 2 of the men climbed down, moving toward the equipment shed with the efficient indifference of people performing a transaction rather than witnessing one. The man from the buggy stepped down and smoothed his vest. He carried a leather satchel and a clipboard, and he looked at the shed, at the John Deere plow standing in the open doorway, at the serial numbers painted on its frame. He looked at everything on the Stout property except Willa herself, as though she were a detail the paperwork hadn't accounted for. "That's my plow." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I'm in the middle of preparing ground. You can't take it now." He looked at her then. His face was the face of a man who had never burned the back of his neck in July, or lost feeling in his fingers in January. A face that had been kept carefully indoors while other faces were being shaped by weather and work and loss. "Prairie Land Bank of Caldwell Bend," he said, opening the satchel. "The account is 97 days past due. The collateral is being repossessed per the terms of the loan agreement. I have 40 acres to plant." The words came out slower than she meant them to, weighted. "If I don't get seed in the ground before the window closes, I lose the crop. If I lose the crop, I don't make the next payment either. You take that plow, you're not just taking a machine. You're taking the thing that makes every other thing possible." He checked something on his clipboard. "I'm sorry, Miss Stout. We have additional stops this afternoon." They hooked the John Deere to the flatbed in less than 10 minutes. Willa stood at the fence with her bare hand wrapped around the top rail, the cold iron biting into her palm, and she watched her father's plow. The one Edgar Stout had purchased secondhand from a farm implement dealer in 1879, the one he had repaired himself 4 times and never once let rust through a winter. Roll away on the back of a stranger's wagon. The smell of the road, coal oil and horse sweat and iron wheel rims on gravel lingered in the air long after the wheels were gone. From the far side of Red Wing Road, Obadiah Marsh leaned against his fence post with the ease of a man who had been waiting for something to happen and was satisfied that it finally had. He was 67 years old, weathered to the grain, with a jaw that had been set against the world for so long it had simply grown that way. He'd farmed Granger's Bluff County for 4 decades, and he had never liked Edgar Stout, finding in the man a stubbornness that mirrored his own too closely for comfort. He liked Willa considerably less. A woman farming alone, a young woman at that, represented a category of error that Ob Marsh did not have language for but felt deeply in his bones. "Told you last fall, you couldn't carry that note." He didn't bother raising his voice. The distance was short enough. "Should have sold when you had offers, girl. Bank's going to have this land before Christmas." Willa looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to let him know she had heard, not long enough to give him anything in return. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn. The barn had been built in 1861 by her great-grandfather, Clement Stout, who had hauled the timber himself from a stand of oak 3 miles east and fitted the beams by hand with the help of 2 neighbors and a great deal of patience. It was older than Kansas's admission to the Union, and it looked it, but it was sound where the walls met the foundation, and the roof had never leaked in 30 years of Willa's memory. Inside, the equipment shed attached to the barn's north wall held a broken cultivator, a seed drill that had not functioned since before Willa was born, her father's tools hanging on their nails in the order Edgar had always kept them, and now, nothing else. The space where the John Deere had stood looked enormous in its emptiness, the oil stain on the floor still the shape of the machine that was no longer there. Willa sat down on a hay bale. She did not cry. She had done her crying 3 years ago, kneeling in the north pasture next to her father while the sky turned the particular orange of a Kansas evening. And she not cried since because there was no one to witness it, and crying alone seemed like spending something she couldn't afford to lose. 40 acres. A planting window that had been closing a little more with every warm day. No equipment, no credit, no help she could call on. And $37 in the Prairieland bank account that she could not touch without triggering the next clause in the loan agreement. 4 generations of Stouts had worked this ground. Clement had broken the original prairie sod in 1851 with a team of Percherons and a stubborn faith in the land that Willa was beginning to think had been its own kind of madness. Her grandfather, Warren Stout, had survived the drought years by selling milk door to door in Caldwell Bend, driving his wagon before dawn, returning after dark, never once discussing how close it had been. Edgar had expanded to 40 acres, purchased the John Deere, built the equipment shed, put up the second fence line along the south boundary. And then his heart had simply stopped, out in the north pasture on a September afternoon, and Willa had found him just before sunset, the way you find something you were not prepared to find. She had tried everything in the 3 years since. Wheat one season, oats the next, soybeans the year the rains came right. Vegetables for the Caldwell Bend market that paid better per pound, but cost more in labor than they ever returned in cash. 3 nights a week at the Caldwell Bend eating house, taking orders and clearing plates and carrying herself with the particular dignity of a person who needs the work but refuses to be diminished by it. She had sold her mother's jewelry piece by piece, starting with the least sentimental and working her way down until only the plain things remained. She had sold Edgar's hunting rifles to a man in Wichita who came up for the estate auction that never materialized into more than one buyer. She had sold the good china that her grandmother had brought from Ohio in a crate packed with straw, 18 pieces, not a chip among them. She had kept the farm running on determination and the kind of improvisation that looks like resourcefulness from the outside and feels like desperation from the inside. Now the bank had taken the one machine that made it possible to break ground in time. Willa sat in the barn and let herself think for several minutes without interrupting herself. The light came through the loft gaps in pale diagonal lines, catching dust that drifted with the slow patience of things that had nowhere to be. The barn smelled of old hay, of the particular sweetness of dry wood that has been warm and cold, and warm again across more seasons than she could count, of leather and oil and something beneath those things that she could not have named, but recognized as belonging specifically to this place. She looked up at the wall beside the loft ladder. Her grandfather's harnesses hung there in a row, 5 sets of them, unused since Warren Stout had died and Edgar had bought the John Deere and declared that horsepower measured in animals was a chapter the century had finished writing. The leather had dried and cracked in places, the brass fittings gone green with 30 years of disuse. But they were whole. She could see that from where she sat. The stitching still held, the rings were intact, the collar shapes had not lost their structure. Horsepower. Willa stood up. She crossed the barn and put her hand on the nearest collar. The leather was cold and stiff, the surface webbed with fine cracks, but beneath the neglect she could feel the quality of what it had been. The weight, the careful stitching, the kind of thing made by someone who understood that a harness carried the relationship between a woman and her land as much as it carried the plow. She smelled neat's foot oil, faint but present, the oil her grandfather had worked into the leather every Saturday evening after supper. She did not know how to hitch a draft horse. She had ridden a county fair pony when she was 8, and that was the complete catalog of her experience with horses of any kind. But she knew her great-grandfather had broken this ground with horses before a single mechanized engine existed in Granger's Bluff County. She knew her grandfather had farmed 40 acres with a Belgian team until his knees gave out in his 70s. She knew that people had grown food from soil without any of Edgar's machines for longer than those machines had existed, and that the knowledge required to do it had not vanished from the earth simply because progress had arrived and made it temporarily unnecessary. The next morning, before the cold had fully lifted, Willa drove Edgar's old farm wagon, the one asset the bank had declined to pursue because its value did not justify the cost of collection, down the rutted county road toward the Granger's Bluff County livestock auction on the south edge of Caldwell Bend. The night before, she had spent 2 hours going through the house with the careful thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory of what remained. In the back of the kitchen closet, she found the tin box Edgar kept behind the loose board in the floor. She had known it was there since she was 12, had known her father kept it the way men of his generation kept private reserves quietly and without discussion. Inside were $211 in mixed bills and coins, along with a folded note in Edgar's handwriting that said only, "For when the farm needs the most important thing." She had stood in the kitchen for a long time with the note in her hand. That morning she had also stopped at Hadley's Sundry on the way to the wagon, where she sold Edgar's silver pocket watch, the one engraved on the back with his initials and the year of his own father's birth, to the proprietor for $61. The man had known Edgar. He offered the price without negotiation, folding the watch into a felt cloth with more care than the transaction required, and Willa understood that this was its own form of condolence. She walked into the auction barn with $312 and a specific purpose. The auction smelled of manure and sawdust and the particular anxiety of livestock that did not understand why they had been moved from familiar surroundings. Farmers she recognized sold off portions of herds they could not afford to carry through another season. Young men in good hats bid on beef cattle with the brisk efficiency of people to whom animals were units of commerce rather than years of labor. Willa moved through the cattle section and the sheep pens and the poultry crates until she reached the far corner of the barn, where the draft horses stood in their own row of stalls, largely ignored. There were 4 horses in the section, 2 mares too old to be economical, a young Clydesdale with a crooked blaze who shied at every sound, and in the last stall, standing alone with his head hanging low, a Belgian gelding the color of burnt caramel. He was enormous, 18 hands at least, built through the chest and shoulder in the way of horses bred for work over generations, with a white blaze running from pole to muzzle and hooves that seemed almost architectural in their size. His ribs showed clearly through his winter coat. The coat itself was dull, the kind of dull that comes not from disease but from inadequate feed and the particular depression that some animals display when they have been separated from the work that organized their lives. His name on the auction card was Brutus, and the notes below indicated he was being sold from the estate of Eli Prentice, deceased, whose sons had determined that a draft horse was not a practical inheritance. Willa walked to the stall rail. Brutus lifted his head. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, with the depth of color that occurs in certain horses and certain people who have absorbed more than their share of difficulty and converted it, through some internal process, into something steadier than ordinary patience. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not fear, not hope, but something occupying the same territory as both, the look of a creature that has been surprised before and has learned to wait before deciding what the surprise means. That one's got a hitch in his left hind. A man in canvas overalls had materialized at her shoulder, a toothpick working steadily between his teeth. Arthritis, most likely. Prentice worked him hard in his younger years. Veterinarians said 2 or 3 good seasons left in him if he's not pushed past his limit. How much does he open at? The man studied her with the kind of assessment that happens so quickly in rural communities as to be nearly imperceptible. He looked at her boots, at her coat, at the set of her jaw. 200 to start. But I'll be honest with you. Nobody in this barn is going to bid on that animal. Draft horses go to rendering these days. If you're serious about buying him, you're probably doing him a service. Willa purchased Brutus for $220. She spent another $60 at the tack shop 3 blocks from the auction barn, where the proprietor was conducting a slow and resigned liquidation of his inventory. The harness she chose was old but sound, the leather still supple where it mattered, the hardware complete. A single-bottom plow she found rusted behind the feed merchant's storage building, the merchant practically grateful to have it removed. A cultivator from a man she encountered near the auction, who needed space in his storage, shed more urgently than he needed $20. She loaded Brutus into the wagon bed with the help of a loading ramp the auction barn kept for the purpose, and the horse stepped up with the deliberate care of a large animal navigating an unfamiliar situation, his hooves loud on the wooden floor. On the drive back to Red Wing Road, he stood with his head over the wagon's side rail, the wind moving through his mane, breathing the countryside with an attention that seemed almost purposeful. When she turned onto Red Wing Road and slowed for the gate, Obadiah Marsh was in his usual position at his fence line. He watched her pull up. He watched her lower the tailgate. He watched Brutus step down onto stout ground with the unhurried gravity of 18 hands of Belgian coming to rest, and then Ob Marsh started to laugh. It was a genuine laugh, not a mean one exactly. More the laughter of a man encountering something so far outside his expectations that his body did not know any other response. He held his fence post with one hand and bent forward with the other on his knee, wheezing, and when he recovered enough to speak, he called across the road. Lord Almighty, Willa Stout bought herself a plow horse. Girl, you have completely lost your mind. That animal belongs in a parade, not a field. You know how long it's going to take you to work 40 acres with one horse. You'll still be planting in August. Willa did not turn her head toward him. She put her hand on Brutus's neck where it met his shoulder, felt the warmth beneath the dull coat, felt the muscle that still lived there under the winter weight loss, and the neglect. The horse dropped his nose toward the stout ground and breathed in, nostrils wide, reading the soil the way horses read everything, with the whole body rather than just the eyes. For the first time in 3 years, Willa did not feel entirely alone on this property. That night she lit the kitchen lamp and spread her grandfather's farming journals across the table. Warren Stout had kept records with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the past was the most useful document available to the present. Planting dates, rainfall amounts, yield records by crop and by field section, notes on soil behavior after wet winters and dry springs. Interspersed with the farming records were technical diagrams, harness fittings labeled in his careful hand, hoof care instructions with small illustrated cross-sections, sketches showing plow angle adjustments for different soil densities, notes on the relationship between walking speed and furrow consistency. It was an education accumulated over 40 years and recorded in pencil on the pages of 6 composition books, stained with coffee and field dirt. Willa read until her eyes would no longer cooperate, then read another hour after that. She was still at the table when she heard the sound outside. Not an alarming sound, just hooves shifting in the barn, Brutus settling into his new stall, the particular percussion of a large animal redistributing its weight in an unfamiliar space. She sat for a moment listening to it, and something in her chest that had been compressed for a very long time shifted fractionally toward something she had no immediate name for. She found the second discovery by accident. While returning the 6th journal to its place on the kitchen shelf, she dislodged a loose board at the back of the cabinet, and behind it, in a space too small to be a proper hiding place and too deliberate to be an accident, she found a box. Inside were 4 things: a handful of coins, $44 in paper bills, a folded photograph of Warren Stout and his wife standing beside a Belgian horse, and on the back of the photograph in Warren's handwriting, "This is how the Stout farm began. This is how it will continue if we remember what we are." Edgar Stout had never read his father's journals. She understood that now. Edgar had looked at a machine and seen the future, and had not thought to ask what the future might cost. But Warren's education was still here, still intact, waiting in 6 composition books for someone who had run out of better options. Willa was up before dawn. She fed Brutus a mixture of oats and dry grass from the barn's remaining supply, checked his hooves as her grandfather's notes described, and began working the old harness with the neat's foot oil she found in the equipment shed, rubbing it slowly into the cracked sections until the leather began to remember what it was supposed to be. Agnes Prentice arrived at 5 in the morning. Willa heard the buggy wheels on the frozen ground and came out of the barn to find a woman of perhaps 58 years climbing down from a black Morgan with the efficiency of someone accustomed to doing things without assistance. Agnes Prentice was not tall, but she carried herself with the compacted authority of a person who had decided long ago what she thought and was no longer interested in revising it. Her husband had been Eli Prentice, who had owned Brutus, and she had driven to Stout Farm before sunrise because she had been at the auction and she had seen who bought her husband's horse, and she had her own opinion about what happened next. She walked past Willa into the barn. She went directly to Brutus's stall and spent 3 minutes examining the horse with her hands, running them down his legs, checking the sensitive area behind his left hind knee, looking at his feet, assessing his weight, pressing her thumb against his gum line to check hydration. Brutus stood for all of it with the patience of a horse that understood examination. Then Agnes turned around. "You've never hitched a draft horse. It was not a question. I can see it in how you've laid out that harness. You've been reading about it, which is good, but reading and doing are 2 conversations that don't always agree." She pulled off her coat and hung it on the nearest nail. "I have 4 hours before I need to be elsewhere. I suggest we use them." The next 4 hours were the most technically demanding of Willa's life, which was saying something for a woman who had spent 3 years learning to do alone what 2 people are meant to do together. Agnes Prentice taught the way some people teach, without condescension and without patience for mistakes made twice. The collar had to sit correctly on the shoulder, not the neck. Weight distribution was everything, and a collar set wrong would ruin a horse's back inside a week. The traces had to run even. The hames had to be seated before the belly band was fastened. The plow attachment required a particular sequence that accommodated the horse's movement rather than fighting it. When Agnes finally said they were ready, Willa picked up the lines and felt the weight of them. The particular alive weight of leather, connected to an animal that was waiting to understand what she wanted. "Click your tongue twice, then say walk," Agnes said, standing 6 feet back with her arms crossed. "Don't shout. He hears fine." Willa clicked her tongue twice. "Walk." Brutus leaned into the collar. The plow bit the earth with a sound like something releasing, a long exhalation, and the first furrow opened behind them, dark and rich, the soil turning with the particular slowness of real ground, being worked by real weight rather than machine speed. The furrow was not straight. It curved at the start where Willa had pulled the left line too hard, then corrected wide the other direction before she found the balance. She pulled the plow to the end of the run, turned Brutus with more difficulty than she expected, and started the second furrow. This one was straighter. The third was straighter still. By the 10th furrow, she understood something the journals had described, but that she had not been able to fully comprehend until her hands were in it. Brutus knew the work. He adjusted his pace when the ground got heavy without being asked. He stopped before she saw the rock in the next section, giving her time to clear it. He walked a consistent line once he understood what she wanted, his enormous hooves placing themselves with a care that seemed almost considered. He was not a machine that she was operating. He was a partner that she was learning to communicate with, and the communication moved in both directions. Agnes watched the first dozen furrows without speaking. When Willa came to the end of the run and turned back, she found the older woman standing at the field edge, arms still folded, looking at the worked ground from a distance rather than crouching over it. After a moment, Agnes walked the length of the turned row and pressed the toe of her boot into the soil. "Your grandfather understood this land," Agnes said. "Most people who farm the same ground for 40 years stop listening to it. Willa Stout listened until the end." She looked up. "The soil in this east section is different from the west. Did you notice?" Willa had noticed, in the way you notice things you don't yet have language for. The east section turned darker, held its structure better, broke apart in larger coherent pieces rather than crumbling fine. "I thought I was imagining it. You weren't." Agnes pointed toward the boundary between the two sections, 40 yards distant. "Your grandfather grazed his draft horses on this section in the winter. 30 years of manure worked in by hoof. The west section was his cash crop ground tilled clean every year. The chemistry is different. You can feel it underfoot if you know what you're looking for." She turned back toward the gate. "Tuesday," she said, the same word she'd offered at the close of that first instruction, and climbed into her buggy and drove toward Caldwell Bend. Willa plowed until the light failed. By the end of the day, she had turned just over 1 acre. It was, by any industrial measure, a catastrophically slow rate of progress. Marsh had told her she'd be planting in August, and standing at the edge of her worked ground in the violet hour before dark. She did the arithmetic and understood that 1 acre a day would indeed put her deep into a season she could not recover from. But the soil. She walked the turned acre in the last light, kneeling once to press her hands into the earth at the section where Agnes had pointed. The ground between the furrows was different from anything she had produced with the John Deere in 3 years of operation. It was loose and layered, the way soil looks in cross-section in agricultural textbooks, but rarely looks in Kansas fields after decades of machine cultivation. She could see earthworm channels. She could smell the particular richness of disturbed microbial earth, the smell that means the ground is alive rather than merely present. She went inside, ate standing at the kitchen counter because she was too tired to sit, and fell into bed with her work clothes still on. Before sleep came, she lay looking at the ceiling and doing a different kind of arithmetic. Not the discouraging calculation of acres per day, but a slower accounting. Her grandfather had farmed 40 acres with horses. He had done it through drought years and late springs and early frosts. He had done it without the benefit of agricultural extension offices or soil science literature or any of the modern apparatus of advice. He had done it because he understood the ground under his feet, the way you can only understand something you have touched with your hands every day for 40 years. She had her grandfather's records. She had a horse that knew the work. She had Agnes Prentice's knowledge arriving every Tuesday. She had the particular stubbornness that her father had called her worst quality, and her best one in the same breath, on the same afternoon, 3 months before he died. She had 40 acres and a closing window and $37 and no machine and no credit and no margin for the kind of mistake that could only be made once. Outside, the Kansas night pressed down on Stout Farm with the weight of all the nights that had come before it. In the barn, she could hear Brutus in his stall, the sound of his breathing, steady and slow, a large creature at rest in new surroundings, already accommodating itself to what this place required. The first furrow had been crooked. The 10th had been straighter. That was the only mathematics that mattered tonight. April came in cold and stayed that way through the first 2 weeks, the ground giving up its frost in stages, reluctant and slow. Like something that had been held tight for so long it had forgotten how to let go. Willa was out every morning before the sky finished deciding what color it meant to be, moving through the dark barn with the muscle memory that was already replacing conscious thought. The grain measure, the water check, the inspection of Brutus's left hind leg that Agnes had shown her, pressing 2 fingers against the joint above the hoof to feel for heat that would indicate the arthritis flaring. Most mornings the leg was cool. Some mornings it was warmer than it should have been, and on those days Willa adjusted the work, kept the runs shorter, gave the horse longer rest intervals in the shade of the equipment shed's remaining wall. She had no one to tell her whether she was reading the signs correctly. She read them anyway, comparing what she felt each morning against Agnes's instructions and her grandfather's notes on animal husbandry, triangulating between two sources of knowledge until she developed her own. By mid-April, she had turned 11 acres. The pace had improved since the first day. Not dramatically, but consistently, the way improvement happens when it comes from repetition rather than inspiration. She and Brutus had arrived at an understanding that neither of them could have articulated, but both of them operated within. He knew her click, knew the pressure of her hands on the lines, knew that a double tug on the right meant a wide turn rather than a correction. She knew that he dropped his left ear when he was tired before his body showed it. Knew that a particular shortening of his stride meant he had located something in the earth worth pausing for. Knew that he worked better in the cool of morning than the heat of afternoon. And planned the heaviest sections accordingly. Agnes arrived each Tuesday at first light and stayed until noon. She did not arrive with lessons prepared. She watched Willa work and interrupted when something was wrong, and what she said was always specific. The angle of the plow blade was creating unnecessary drag. Brutus was compensating for uneven traces by pulling right, which would stress his shoulder over time. Willa was gripping the handles too tightly on the turns, making the work harder for herself rather than letting the weight of the implement carry through. Each correction was delivered without warmth or impatience, simply as information that existed and was being transmitted. One Tuesday in late April, Agnes arrived carrying a cedar box that she set on the barn floor without explanation, and did not open for the first hour. She watched Willa work the east section in silence, and when Willa finally brought Brutus in at noon, Agnes lifted the lid. Inside were 6 composition books, different from Warren's, the handwriting tighter, more compressed, formed with visible deliberateness. Not Warren Stout's hand. "My husband found these when we bought our south field from the Aldgate estate 20 years ago," Agnes said. "The man who owned that land before the Aldgates was named Clement Stout. He farmed it until 1871. She set the first book in Willa's hands. "I believe these belong here." The name on the first page was written in that same compressed script, Clement Stout, his book. Begun 1848, Willa's great-grandfather. The man who had broken the original sod with Percherons and faith, who had come to Kansas before it was a state, and had planted himself in this ground as deliberately as he had planted everything else. The journals went through 1871, the year he died, and they were a different kind of document than Warren's. Less technical, more philosophical, the record of a man working out what he believed through the process of writing it down. She read by lamplight until nearly midnight, Brutus shifting occasionally in his stall with the comfortable sounds of a horse at rest. Clement Stout had written about soil the way other men wrote about scripture, with the conviction that it contained more information than he could ever fully decode, that his job was to ask it questions rather than issue instructions. He had written about his horses with the specificity of a man who understood that the animals were not equipment but collaborators, that the quality of the relationship affected the quality of the work in ways he could demonstrate but not fully explain. One passage stopped her completely. "A man told me in Caldwell Bend that horses are slow and will soon be replaced by something faster. I told him that slow is not what he thinks it is. I have farmed this section for 11 years, and the ground improves each year. My neighbor has farmed his section for 11 years with methods he calls efficient, and his ground worsens each year. At the end of 40 years, which of us will have more? Speed is a strange virtue in a relationship that is meant to last longer than you do." Willa closed the book and sat with it in her hands for a while, in the particular silence of a house that has not had a second person in it for years. She planted her oats in the first week of May. The 12 acres she had prepared in April were ready, the soil loose and textured in a way she would not have known to describe 6 weeks earlier, but now recognized as correct. She used the hand-crank seeder from her grandfather's storage corner of the barn, walking the rows while Brutus followed behind, dragging a timber log harrow that pressed the seed into contact with the soil. It took 3 days. Every stage of the process was slower than its mechanical equivalent by a factor she tried not to calculate. When the last row was covered, she stood at the field edge in the May evening and felt something she recognized from Clement's journals. Not satisfaction exactly, which implied completion, but a particular quality of presence, of having put her hands on every inch of what she had done. 10 days later, the oats emerged. She was crossing the field on the way to check the west fence line when she saw the green. A film of it first, barely distinguishable from the color of the soil in certain light, and then unmistakably itself. The first growth color of oat seedlings, the pale yellow-green of new life that has not yet been in the sun long enough to deepen. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the field for a long time doing nothing but looking. She had expected them to fail. She understood this only now, standing among the first growth. Some part of her had been managing the expectation of failure the entire time, keeping it close and familiar, because failure was something she knew how to survive. Success in this particular form, small green lives, pushing up through ground she had worked by hand and horse, was something she had not fully prepared for. She crouched down and studied the seedlings at close range. They were perfectly formed, each one a tiny architecture of stem and emerging leaf, fragile in the way that young things are fragile before they become the tough, bending stalks of summer. The soil around them was dark with moisture from the previous night's rain, and she could smell both things at once, the green of the plants sharp and clean, and the deep earth smell of soil that was working the way soil is supposed to work. The oats grew 2 inches, then 4. The spring rains arrived in the gentle pattern that Kansas sometimes offered in May, not the violent convective storms of summer, but the slow soaking rains that went down into the ground rather than running off the top of it. Willa watched the weekly rainfall with the attentiveness of someone learning a language, comparing each measurement against her grandfather's recorded averages, assessing what the crop was receiving against what it needed. She cultivated between the rows with Brutus, pulling the single cultivator, working at walking pace through the young crop, with a precision that a machine would not have offered. The horse moved with care she had not asked for and did not need to instruct. His feet found the gaps between the rows instinctively, the same way horses navigate rough terrain, by reading the ground through their hooves. She walked behind him in the particular posture she had developed, weight slightly back, handles loose, letting the implement find its angle rather than forcing it. Her shoulders had stopped aching after the 3rd week. Her hands had gone past blisters and into the hard, specific calluses that develop on the inside of the fingers when the same pressure is applied to the same spots for long enough. In late May, she bought Duchess. The decision came from arithmetic rather than ambition. One horse working the manageable ground covered adequately, but she had 20 acres beyond the cultivated section that needed to be prepared if the farm was going to produce enough to cover the bank payment due in September. She had calculated the numbers on the yellow legal pad she kept on the kitchen table, running the figures forward from what the oat crop should yield at the prices the Lawrence mill was paying for organic grain, adding the honey projections Agnes had mentioned when she noticed the buckwheat Willa had planted in the south section, bringing in the first bees. The numbers worked if she had 2 horses. They did not quite work if she had one. Duchess came from a farm 20 miles east, where a man named Horace Bellamy had purchased her the previous year for his wife's interest in exhibition driving, an interest that had not survived contact with the reality of caring for a 1,700-pound animal. Horace Bellamy was relieved to have a serious buyer. Duchess was 5 years old, Belgian, built lower and wider than Brutus, with a Roman nose that gave her face a permanent expression of mild skepticism and ears of noticeably different lengths that she moved independently, as though they were gathering information from separate sources. She cost $130, which Willa paid from wages saved at the eating house and from the first sales of eggs and garden produce at the farm gate. She led Duchess into the barn on a Thursday evening and introduced her to Brutus by way of opening the shared gate between the 2 stalls. What followed was 2 weeks of negotiation that Agnes had predicted in detail, and Willa had not fully believed until she witnessed it. Horses established hierarchy through proximity and pressure, and a vocabulary of small physical gestures that looked from the outside like nothing in particular and meant, to the horses, everything. Brutus was 17 years old and had been the only horse on this property for 2 months. Duchess was 5 and had never worked in harness with another animal. They circled and shouldered and pinned ears and exhaled opinions at each other across the stall divider, with the intensity of strangers who had been given no choice but to come to terms. Agnes watched them from the barn door on the following Tuesday. "Don't rush it. You can't make 2 horses trust each other. You can only not prevent it." She folded her arms. "My husband always said that hitching 2 horses who don't know each other is like asking 2 people who've never spoken to carry a piano up a flight of stairs together. The piano doesn't care about their feelings, but the feelings affect the piano." Willa spent the 2 weeks doing the low-intensity work of letting the horses share space, grazing them together in the small paddock, leading them side by side on the road in front of the property, allowing the relationship to develop through contact rather than demand. It cost her time she felt she could not afford. She used it to hand-weed the oat field edges, to repair the south fence where the winter had pushed 3 posts crooked, to extend the bee yard by adding 2 new hives she had built from lumber, salvaged from the collapsed corner of the equipment shed. On the 15th day, she hitched Brutus and Duchess to the 2-bottom plow together for the first time, and the first 50 yards were chaos. Different rhythms, different responses to line pressure, Duchess pulling ahead and then overcorrecting back while Brutus maintained his own pace with the patience of a horse that had already worked out his relationship with this particular kind of demand. Then something shifted, in the way that working relationships sometimes shift without a visible cause, as though both parties had decided simultaneously that cooperation was more interesting than resistance. The 2-bottom plow bit into the west section's ground and the pace doubled. Not machine pace, nothing about this was machine pace, but a working pace, a rhythm that had its own internal logic, the sound of two horses breathing in near unison and four hooves finding a shared cadence on the Kansas ground. By the end of the day, she had turned 4 acres. She planted buckwheat on the new ground in early June, a fast crop, 10 weeks to maturity, chosen from her grandfather's notes because it fixed nitrogen in depleted soil and required less preparation than oats or wheat. Agnes had confirmed the choice on the previous Tuesday, adding that buckwheat also attracted pollinators in numbers that would benefit every subsequent crop on the property, a consideration Willa had not known to have, but immediately understood as important. The storm came on the 14th of June, 11 days after the buckwheat went in. It built from the west in the late afternoon, the way Kansas storms build, gathering itself against the horizon until the horizon was no longer a line but a wall, dark gray graduating to green at the base, the particular green that means hail is possible. Willa was cultivating the oat field when she saw it, and she stood for a moment with the lines in her hands, assessing the speed of the build and the direction of the wind shift, doing the calculation that farmers do when weather is coming and the crop is young. She unhitched Brutus from the cultivator, led both horses into the barn, checked that the doors were latched on the outside against wind pressure, and then went back out into what was by now a committed pre-storm darkness, the light gone strange and yellowish, to close the shutters on the south and west sides of the house. She went inside for 10 minutes, thought better of it, and went back out to the barn. She could not explain the compulsion to be with the horses during what was coming. It was not a rational response. The barn was sound. Clement had built it against Kansas winters, and Kansas had validated the construction across decades of trying. But she took her lamp and went out anyway, and when she sat down on the hay in the space between the two stalls, Brutus dropped his nose to her shoulder and left it there, and Duchess, after a moment of the mild skepticism her face always suggested, moved to the other side and pressed her forehead against the stall wall in a way that managed to communicate solidarity despite its awkwardness. The storm hit with the full conviction of a Kansas June. Rain that was not falling so much as arriving horizontally, driven by wind that found every gap in the barn siding and sent thin cold currents through the interior. Lightning that turned the barn's interior to white several times per minute at the storm's peak, each flash showing Willa the same image. 2 large horses standing steady in their stalls, heads lowered, ears back, enduring. The thunder that followed each flash was physical, felt in the sternum rather than heard. It lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes by the clock on the barn wall that Edgar had hung and Willa had kept wound. When it ended, the silence that followed had a different quality from ordinary nighttime silence. The silence of something spent, of a system that had discharged what it had accumulated, and was now resting in the aftermath of its own force. Willa took her lamp and went out to the oat field. The stalks were down. Not all of them, not broken. Flattened was the word. Bent horizontal by the wind-driven rain, the young stalks pressed against the soil in the direction the storm had moved through. In the lamplight, she crouched between the rows and touched the stems, feeling for the snap that would mean structural damage. The stems bent. They did not break. She walked the entire 12 acres in the wet dark, row by row, moving the lamp low to assess what she was finding. Where her neighbor's machine-tilled fields would, by morning, show the channeled erosion of water that had moved across rather than into the ground, her soil had absorbed the rain. Not all of it, not perfectly, but substantially. The earth between the oat rows was saturated but intact, held together by the root structures and the particular texture that horse cultivation left behind. She could feel the difference between this ground and the harder sections at the field edge where she hadn't yet worked. The way water pooled at the boundary between the two. The oats would stand again. She had read enough of Warren's notes to know that young grain bent by rain recovered in 2 to 3 days, the stems reorienting toward light. She stood in the middle of the 12 acres at close to midnight, wet through her coat, mud on her knees from where she had crouched repeatedly to check root contact, and she laughed. Not from relief exactly, more from the particular surprise of finding that the things she had built with such uncertain hands had more resilience than she had credited it with. Bob Marsh drove past on the road the following morning, going toward Caldwell Bend at the pace of a man who had not spent the previous night in a barn. He slowed when he passed the stout field. The oats were still bent, still recovering their angle in the early morning sun, still visibly stressed by the previous night. Bob looked at them for a long moment, jaw working. Then he looked at Willa, who was in the field checking the north section's recovery. Storm like that takes a tender crop right out. The satisfaction was quieter than it would have been 2 months ago, she noticed. More careful. Your timing was always wrong on this. Willa kept her eyes on the oats. Come back in a week. He did not respond to that. The wagon moved on. The oats were upright again in 4 days. July brought heat that settled over Granger's Bluff County like something that intended to stay. Willa began the day's work before 5 and was out of the fields by 2 in the afternoon, spending the hottest hours on the tasks that could be done in shade. Harness maintenance, hive inspection, the slow work of finishing the third and fourth beehives from the lumber she had been accumulating. The bees that had found the buckwheat flowers were producing with the urgency of a short season, and when she harvested the first frames in mid-July, the honey was dark. Genuinely dark, nearly the color of molasses, with a flavor that was nothing like the clover honey she had grown up eating. Agnes tasted it on a Tuesday morning and held it on her tongue for a moment before setting the spoon down. Buckwheat honey. Agnes looked at the jar with the expression of someone recognizing a thing they had been told about but never seen. My mother kept bees for 40 years, and she said this was the most valuable honey she produced. She could never sell it here because people didn't know what to do with it. A pause, during which she appeared to recalculate something. They will now. The world has gotten more curious since my mother's time. Willa brought 6 pounds to the Caldwell Bend market on a Saturday and priced it at $8 a pound, which she had arrived at by calculating backward from the cost of equivalent honey in the dry goods catalog she had found in the bottom of Edgar's desk drawer. She had been uncertain about the price. She sold all 6 pounds before noon. Warren Doyle came by the field in late July, which was unusual. He farmed 200 acres north of Caldwell Bend with the assistance of 3 plows and a harvester he had purchased on credit 2 seasons ago, and he had been one of the more vocal participants in the running assessment of Willa's situation that apparently continued at the Caldwell Bend eating house on the nights she was not working. He slowed his wagon on Red Wing Road and looked at the oat field for a long time without speaking. The oats were knee-high by then, and they were not the color of struggling grain. They were the deep blue-green of a crop that had been fed well from the beginning, the color of ground that had given something rather than having something extracted from it. The stalk stood without lodging, dense and even across the 12 acres, in a way that Willa had not planned for because she had not known to plan for it, that had simply emerged from the combination of seed and soil, and the method of cultivation she had arrived at by accident and necessity. Doyle did not say anything. He looked at the field for perhaps 2 minutes, then looked at Willa, where she stood at the field edge with a hoe, then looked at the field again. Then he drove on. She heard later from one of the waitresses at the eating house that Doyle had not mentioned her name that evening. In a man who had spoken often and confidently about her situation, that silence was its own kind of information. The calculation she had been building toward came to its conclusion in August. She sat at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad and all the numbers she had accumulated across 5 months, doing the addition and subtraction with a patience she had to consciously maintain because the result kept coming back the same, and she kept hoping the next review would produce something different. Oats. 40 bushels from the 12 acres to be sold at $12 a bushel to the Lawrence Mill that Agnes had identified as the buyer for organic grain, $480, minus the $22 for seed purchased in the spring. Buckwheat. She had harvested the south section in early August, before the oats came ready, the timing working out precisely as she had planned. 50 pounds of clean grain sold to the dry goods merchant in Caldwell Bend at $2.10 a pound, $105. Honey. 68 pounds across 3 harvests. At $8 a pound from the market and $6.50 from the merchant, who had taken 20 pounds for his shop, the total came to just over $500, minus the cost of the hive lumber and the frames and the smoker purchased in May. The farm had earned, net of expenses, $712 since March. The bank payment was $310. She set down the pencil. She had not allowed herself to perform this particular calculation until she had all the numbers, because she did not want to be wrong about it in either direction. Now she sat with the result, which was that Stout Farm had produced, in the first season she had worked it without a machine, more income than it had generated in either of the previous 2 seasons with the John Deere. The cost structure was the reason. No fuel, no equipment payments, no chemical inputs. The costs were feed and seed and labor, the labor being her own. The margin on each bushel was different in kind from the margin she had known before, because the denominator had changed. She thought about Edgar, who had bought the machine and called it progress. She thought about Warren, who had written in his journal about the man in Caldwell Bend who said horses were slow and would be replaced. She thought about Clement, who had answered that man before the question was ever put to her. Outside, the oat field stood in the late August heat, golden now and heavy-headed, the stalks bending slightly under the weight of what they had produced. She would need help to harvest. 2 hands and 2 horses were not enough for the reaping and bundling of 12 acres in the time the crop would hold before the weather turned. She drove to Caldwell Bend the following morning and found Thomas and Earl Garnett at the hardware store, doing the thing men without work do, which is occupy a public space without purchasing anything, in the hope that something will materialize. Thomas was 22, Earl 19, both of them sons of a farm family from the eastern part of the county, whose land had been sold to cover debts 2 years previous. They knew the work. They had grown up in it. Willa offered them 6 days of labor in exchange for meals. sleeping space in the barn, and $2 each. Thomas looked at Earl. Earl looked at the middle distance for a moment, doing some arithmetic of his own, and then said they would take it. They came the following Monday, arriving before dawn with their own tools and the particular quality of attention that people bring to work when they understand that the opportunity is not guaranteed to repeat. Willa showed them the oats, showed them the scythes, her grandfather's and two she had borrowed from Agnes, who had kept her husband's tools with the same care she had kept his horses, and they began. The rhythm of 3 people working adjacent rows with scythes was not a comfortable rhythm. Not at first. Thomas worked fast and tired himself. Earl worked slower and more consistently. Willa found the pace that the grain dictated rather than the one her impatience preferred, and by the second day all 3 of them had converged on a shared tempo, the blades arcing and falling in a sequence that looked from a distance almost choreographed. The heat was specific and personal, in the way August heat is in Kansas, arriving with the sun and building through the morning, until by 10 o'clock the air above the cut grain shimmered, and the handles of the scythes were wet with sweat that dried immediately and left salt crystals on the wood. Willa stopped them at 2 in the afternoon and put them in the shade of the barn with cold water from the well until 4, when the temperature allowed work again. She extended the days at both ends to compensate. On the 4th, 20 minutes before noon, with the last section of oats still standing and 2 days of work remaining, Brutus went down. She heard Duchess first, a sharp snort, the sound a horse makes when something wrong has entered its perception. Willa was 30 yards away, tying a sheaf, and she turned in time to see Brutus in the process of folding, the great weight of him coming down in the slow, terrible way of large animals whose legs are no longer able to hold what they have been built to hold. He went to his knees first, then to his side, and the sound of him landing on the Kansas ground was the sound of something enormous becoming still. She ran. He was breathing when she reached him, breathing in the pattern of a horse in significant pain, fast and shallow, nostrils wide, the sides of his chest moving with an urgency that was wrong in an animal who normally moved with such economy. His left hind leg was extended at an angle that made something in her go cold. She put her hands on him, on his neck, on his shoulder, on the leg, feeling for heat and finding it immediately above the hock. The joint hot in a way that went past the ordinary warmth of exertion into something more serious. Thomas came up beside her, stopped, said nothing. Get to Caldwell Bend. Her voice came out flat, which was not how she felt. There's a veterinarian on the east end of Merchant Street, Dr. Samuel Hatch. Tell him I have a draft horse down and I need him at Stout Farm on Red Wing Road. Thomas was already moving. She heard his boots on the ground, heard the barn door, heard the second wagon being taken out at speed. Brutus turned his head toward her. His eye found her face and stayed there, dark and patient in the particular way she had come to understand as his default mode of regarding the world. Not passive, not resigned, but constitutionally committed to the idea that the present moment, whatever it contained, was worth attending to. She put her hand on his face. She did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying between them at that point, the relationship having moved past language into something older and more direct. Dr. Hatch arrived 2 hours later, which was faster than Thomas's round trip should have allowed, and Willa understood that Thomas had pushed the horse harder than the animal strictly wanted to go. A detail she noted and was grateful for. Hatch was a man of 60 or so, with the unhurried manner of a professional, who had reached the point in his career where he could be deliberate because he had learned that speed of movement rarely improved the quality of assessment. He examined the leg with both hands, thoroughly, not rushing. He stood up and looked at Willa with the expression of a man who has something to say that the other person is not going to want to hear. The arthritis in this joint is significant. The heat today pushed it past the threshold where compensation is possible. This horse has been working at the limit of what his body can offer for some time. He paused. The honest recommendation is to put him down. He's in pain, and the structural situation in that joint is not going to improve. The field around them was still. Earl had stopped working and stood 20 yards away with his scythe at his side. Duchess watched from the paddock fence, her mismatched ears fully forward. Willa looked at Brutus. He was watching her still, with the same patient attention. She thought about the 10 furrows that first morning, the first one crooked, the 10th one straight. She thought about the feel of him leaning into the collar when she clicked her tongue, the particular aliveness of that weight at the end of the lines. She thought about the East Field soil that Agnes had pointed to, the soil that had been built by 30 years of Warren Stout's horses and was visibly different from the ground on either side of it. 3 days, she said. Hatch looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man calibrating between professional obligation and the particular stubbornness of the person standing before him. 3 days doesn't change the structural situation. 3 days. Her voice was not loud and it was not uncertain. Come back then. He picked up his bag. I'll come back in 3 days. What you do with those 3 days is your business. When his wagon had gone, Earl walked over and stood next to Willa without speaking. After a moment, he asked what she needed. She needed Agnes. She needed the comfrey root and witch hazel liniment Agnes had mentioned once in passing as something her husband had used, a preparation Agnes still kept the recipe for. She needed cold compresses and warm compresses applied in the specific alternating sequence that reduced joint inflammation, according to her grandfather's notes on horse care that she had memorized without planning to. She sent Earl to Agnes Prentice's house with a note. Agnes arrived within the hour, carrying a basket with the air of a woman who had expected this call and had prepared for it in advance. He's been working at the edge of his capacity since March, Agnes said, crouching beside Brutus with her hands already moving to the leg. You've managed him well. This was going to happen regardless. She began working the liniment into the joint with firm, even pressure. The question is whether the joint can reduce the inflammation enough to restore partial function. It has done it before. I've seen it. She looked up at Willa. I've also seen it not happen. You understand that? Willa understood that. They worked through the night in alternating shifts, 2 hours of treatment, 1 hour of rest, cold compresses in the early hours when Agnes said the joint needed to contract, warm in the morning hours when it needed to open. Brutus lay on his side through most of it, accepting the treatment with the same quality of patience he brought to everything, occasionally turning his head to locate Willa by sound or smell when she moved to the other side of him. On the second day, he ate from her hand, which Agnes said was a sign that the pain was reducing. On the morning of the third day, 2 hours before Dr. Hatch was due to return, Brutus rolled to his knees. He stayed there for a moment, gathering himself, assessing what was available. Willa stood back because Agnes put a hand on her arm and said quietly, "Let him find out for himself." He stood up. Not easily, not without the visible effort of a horse negotiating significant pain, but he stood, and once standing, he shifted his weight experimentally across all 4 feet, and then dropped his nose to the hay on the barn floor and began to eat with the straightforward appetite of an animal that has decided for the time being to continue. Earl was outside the barn door when Willa came out. He had been there most of the night, she suspected, though he had not said so. He looked past her at Brutus, visible through the open door, standing and eating. He nodded once, the way people nod when a thing has happened that they are glad about, but that does not require commentary. When Hatch arrived and examined the leg, he was silent for longer than usual. The inflammation has reduced substantially. He probed the joint carefully. He won't work hard ground for the rest of the season. Light work only, level terrain, short periods. He straightened and looked at Willa with the closest thing to surprise that his professional manner permitted. I've been doing this for 30 years, Miss Stout. I don't often revise my recommendations. Thomas and Earl completed the harvest with Willa over the remaining 2 days, Duchess pulling the grain cart with a steadiness that had been growing in her across the summer, the young horse coming into her own competence the way young things do, not in a straight line, but accumulating, through the work itself, the quality that only the work could teach. 40 bushels of clean oats were stacked in the barn by the last day of August. Willa stood among them in the late afternoon, the whole barn smelling of dry grain and the particular sweetness of a good harvest, and she looked at what 5 months of work had produced and tried to hold it alongside everything it had cost. The number on the yellow legal pad was $712. The number on the bank's ledger was $310. The difference between those two numbers was the distance between where she had been in March and where she stood now. And she was not naive enough to think the hard part was behind her. But the arithmetic had changed. The possibility had changed. She was not calculating survival anymore. She was calculating what came next. September arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in a single afternoon, the sky going from hazy summer white to a hard specific blue that meant the season had made a decision. Willa felt the change in her body before she felt it in the air. The way her joints registered it, the way her breath came out visible for the first time since April. She stood in the barn doorway after the evening feeding and looked at the fields in the new light, the oat stubble catching the low sun in the way of things that have given what they had to give. Brutus had been on reduced work for Dr. Hatch had come back twice, each visit producing a slightly less guarded assessment, and on the second return he had pressed the joint for a long time before saying that the recovery was more complete than he would have predicted. The horse was not restored to full capacity. Hatch was careful about that, but the inflammation had reduced to a level where light field work on level ground was permissible, which meant Willa could use him for the remaining tasks without asking more than he could reasonably offer. She drove to Caldwell Bend on the 12th of September. Prairie Land Bank occupied the corner building on the main street, 2 stories of limestone block that the founders had built to communicate permanence and had succeeded at communicating it in the way that buildings built. To impress always communicate more about what they're afraid of than what they're confident in. Willa pushed through the door at 10 in the morning, when she knew from 3 years of observation that Silas Boone was at his desk rather than at his lunch or in his meetings. The teller directed her without being asked. She had been in this building enough times, always on the wrong side of whatever conversation was happening, that her presence in the lobby produced a particular quality of attention from the staff. Not hostility, something more calibrated than that, the professional alertness of people accustomed to difficult transactions. Boone was behind his walnut desk in the office, whose window faced the street. He was a man of 55 or so, constructed along careful lines, the kind of careful that required daily maintenance, the vest buttoned in the correct sequence, the desk clear except for the papers he was actively using, the quality of his attention when you entered a room, suggesting that he allocated it precisely. He had sent men to Stout Farm in March with a clipboard and a flatbed. He had not come himself. Willa set the cloth bag on his desk without sitting down. He looked at the bag, then at her. $310. I'd like a receipt. He opened the bag. He counted the bills and coins with the practiced speed of a man who has counted money for 30 years, his fingers moving through the stack without hurry. When he finished, he looked up and something crossed his face that was not quite readable. Not surprise, which would have implied he had expected otherwise, but a recalibration, the expression of a person updating an assumption they had held without examining it. He wrote the receipt in his careful hand, blotted it, pushed it across the desk. Willa picked it up, folded it once, put it in her coat pocket. She turned to go. Miss Stout. His voice stopped her at the door. When she turned, he was looking at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to say something he had not planned to say. The Lawrence Mill has been asking around about your grain. I hear they want a reliable supply contract. She held his gaze for a moment. I know. She walked out into the September morning with the receipt in her pocket and stood on the limestone step for a moment, the sun on her face and the street of Caldwell Bend carrying on its ordinary business around her, and the feeling that moved through her was not triumph. Triumph required an opponent worth defeating, and what she had done was not about Silas Boone or his bank. It was quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of a burden set down after such a long time that you had stopped noticing the weight, and the noticing came only in the sudden absence of it. She drove home and did not stop at the eating house. That evening she wrote a letter to the Lawrence Mill confirming her interest in a supply contract for the following year's harvest. The Granger's Bluff County Harvest Fair was held on the 18th of October, which fell on a Thursday that year, the fair committee having determined that a Thursday in mid-October offered better weather odds than the preceding Saturday had. The fairgrounds occupied the south end of Caldwell Bend, a permanent installation of exhibition buildings, and a main square where the competitive events were staged, and the vendors set up their tables from dawn through late afternoon. Willa had not attended the fair in 3 years. There had been no practical reason to attend, no surplus to sell, no resources to spare for a day away from the farm. This year she had both, along with something less quantifiable. A sense that showing up was part of finishing what she had started in March, that the last piece of the accounting was not financial. She spent the evening before at the barn, cleaning the harnesses with the same methodical care she now brought to all the equipment. The leather oiled until it was supple, the brass fittings rubbed to a shine that was not decorative, but was rather the visible evidence of proper maintenance. She braided red and gold ribbons into Brutus's mane, and after a moment's consideration, into Duchess's as well, the older horse accepting the process with dignity, and the younger one accepting it with the resigned tolerance that had become her characteristic response to human decisions she found puzzling. The wagon she loaded with 40 pounds of honey jars, the glass catching the lamplight in the barn as she packed them, deep amber and nearly black depending on the angle. 3 sacks of oat grain, 2 sacks of buckwheat flour, the soaps she had made in August from the rendered lard of the pig she had traded honey for, pressed into rectangular bars with the particular solidity of something made carefully, wrapped in brown paper. She spread a canvas tarp over the load and tied it at the corners. She drove the wagon into Caldwell Bend at noon, Brutus and Duchess stepping in the cadence they had arrived at over the summer, the rhythm of 2 horses that have learned each other well enough to stop negotiating. The fair was in its full afternoon energy when she pulled onto the fairground road, the competitive events winding down and the selling and socializing taking over. People stepped aside as the wagon came through. Draft horses at the fair were not unusual in a farming county, but a team of Belgians in working harness moving with the quiet authority that Brutus and Duchess carried was different from the exhibition animals people brought to show. These were horses that had done something, and whatever it was that showed in working animals was showing. She took the wagon to the south vendor row and unhitched the team at the rail, leaving them with water and hay she had brought in a sack. She pulled back the canvas tarp. She did not arrange the goods elaborately. The jars of honey were stacked in their crates, the grain sacks tied at the top, the soap wrapped and labeled in her handwriting. She set out a small scale for weighing and a tin box for money and waited. Agnes Prentice found her within 10 minutes, coming from the direction of the exhibition building where the women's organization had their table. Agnes looked at the wagon, at the honey crates, at Brutus and Duchess standing at the rail with their braided manes. She pressed her lips together in a way that Willa had learned, across a summer of Tuesdays, to read as satisfaction. "My husband spent 40 years trying to explain to people what this ground could do," Agnes said, looking at the wagon rather than at Willa. He would have been glad to see it explained this way instead. She turned back toward her own table, without elaborating, which was characteristic of her, the kind of woman who said a thing once and trusted the listener to carry it. The first customer arrived before Agnes had taken 3 steps. One of the farm wives from the north end of the county who had bought honey at the market in July and had apparently been waiting for the fair as an occasion to purchase more. She bought 4 pounds and asked whether the buckwheat flour was from the same grain as the honey. Willa said it was. The woman bought 2 pounds off flour. Word moved through the fairground the way word moves in small communities, not through announcement but through the turning of heads. The slight shift in the direction of foot traffic as people recalibrated what they had been heading toward in favor of what had been called to their attention. By 1 in the afternoon, Willa had sold 12 pounds of honey, 1 sack of oats to the man who ran the livery stable, and half the buckwheat flour. Ob Marsh came at 2 o'clock. He came from the direction of the tractor pull staging area, where he had won his annual competition with the particular satisfaction of a man whose annual competition is unchallenged. He still carried himself with the authority of 67 years of doing things the way he had decided to do them, but something in his movement through the fairground had changed from previous years she could remember. He was slower. Not from age exactly, he had always been physically deliberate. Slower in the way of a man who has been looking at something for several months and is still in the process of deciding what it means. He stopped at the wagon. He looked at the honey crates, at what remained in them, at the prices on the cards Willa had written out. He looked at Brutus and Duchess at the rail. He stood for a long time without speaking. He picked up a jar of honey, turned it in the light, set it down, picked it up again. How much is left? Not a question exactly, a calculation being performed out loud. 16 pounds of honey, 1 sack of grain. He set the jar back in the crate with more care than the transaction required, then reached into his coat pocket and produced the money for 6 pounds of honey without asking Willa to confirm the price, counted it out onto the wagon board, and picked up 6 jars, 3 in each large hand. He looked at her then, directly, for perhaps the first time without the overlay of whatever judgment had been operating between them since March. "Ground looks different over there." The over there was not specified but did not need to be. "I've been noticing it since July." Willa held his gaze. She did not fill the pause because the pause was his to fill or leave empty as he chose. He chose to leave it empty. He nodded once, brief, the kind of nod that carries more weight than the gesture itself, and turned and walked back toward the tractor pull staging area with 6 jars of honey and whatever he was going to do with what he had seen. Warren Doyle came on his 3rd pass by the wagon, this time stopping. He stood at a slight distance, not close enough to be obviously looking at the goods, close enough that the pretense of passing was no longer available. His daughter had come with him, a girl of 8 or 9, who had been observing the horses from a cautious distance since the wagon arrived, drawn by the specific magnetism that draft horses exercise on children, who seem to understand instinctively that the size carries no threat. The girl moved toward Brutus as her father stood at his distance. The horse dropped his nose to her level with the patient gravity of an animal that has been through enough to no longer startle easily. She put her hand on his muzzle. He breathed out slowly into her palm. She turned to look for her father without moving her hand. "Papa, why don't we have horses like this?" Doyle looked at his daughter, at the horse, at Willa. The color moved up his neck. He said nothing, which in a man who had spoken often and confidently about Willa's situation over the past 6 months was its own complete answer. The girl asked the horse a question in the private language that children use with animals and waited with perfect seriousness for a response that the horse provided in the form of a slow blink. Willa watched this and felt something unexpected. Not vindication, which required someone to have been wrong and to know it, but the simpler satisfaction of a thing that had been doubted having proven itself, in a form that even an 8-year-old could read without difficulty. By 3 o'clock the wagon was empty, except for 4 pounds of honey she had set aside from the beginning with no intention of selling. She was breaking down the scale and putting the tin money box in her coat when Professor Amos Whitfield arrived. She recognized him from the letter he had sent in September, which had described him as a professor of soil science at the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan. The letter had asked, with the careful politeness of academic correspondence, whether he might visit the farm to take soil samples. He had not, in his letter, mentioned that he would attend the fair. He was a man of 50, slight, carrying a leather satchel that was clearly heavier than it looked, wearing the slightly displaced expression of someone whose natural habitat is a laboratory, and who finds the social architecture of county fairs genuinely puzzling. He introduced himself. looked at the empty wagon, looked at Brutus and Duchess, and pulled a small notebook from his coat. "I spoke to several people about your oat crop today," he said, opening the notebook. "I would like to visit the farm before the ground freezes. I want to take samples from both the worked sections and the unworked boundary areas for comparison." He looked up. "The Lawrence Mill told me your grain tested higher on protein content than their standard supply. They were curious about the variance. I'm curious about the mechanism." Willa told him he could come the following week. He wrote the date in his notebook, snapped it shut, looked at the horses one more time with the expression of a man cataloging data. "The hoof compaction research is 30 years old," he said, almost to himself. "Nobody farms this way anymore. There's no contemporary data." He put the notebook away. There might be after this. He walked back toward the exhibition building, slightly at an angle to his intended direction, in the manner of a man whose mind had already moved on to the next problem while his feet were still navigating the previous location. The drive home took the better part of an hour in the cooling afternoon. Brutus and Duchess moved at the pace the horses chose, which was unhurried, and Willa let them have it. The fair sounds fell behind, and then disappeared entirely, replaced by the particular quiet of the county road in October, the fields on either side stripped and brown, the sky the hard blue of a season that had committed to itself. At the corner of Red Wing Road, a wagon stood stopped at the side of the track. The horse attached to it was Ob Marsh's sorrel, which she knew from months of seeing it at his fence line. Ob himself was not in the wagon. He was standing at the fence line of Stout Farm's east boundary, at the edge of the field that bordered the road, in the way of a man who has gotten out to look at something, rather than continuing to look at it from a moving wagon. He heard her coming and turned. The expression she found on his face was nothing like what she had expected. The complicated arrangement of stubbornness and prior certainty that had organized his face across 9 months of watching her work. What she found instead was something closer to the look of a man standing on the wrong side of a conclusion he had arrived at too slowly. She brought the wagon to a stop. They looked at each other across the road. "I owe you an accounting," he said. The words came out like something that had been rehearsed and had lost some of its preparation in the moment of delivery. "I said things that were wrong. Not wrong the way an opinion can be wrong. Wrong about what you are and what you could do. I've been farming this county longer than you've been alive. I should know better than to decide what's possible before I've seen it." It was the longest consecutive statement she had heard from Ob Marsh that did not serve his own position. She sat with it for a moment on the wagon seat, the reins loose in her hands. "Come look at the east section in the spring," she said. "When it's turned, you'll see what the old method does to ground that was already good." He absorbed this, nodded, got back in his wagon and drove toward his property without the satisfaction in his posture that he had carried for 9 months. Not diminished exactly, reconfigured. She drove the rest of the way to the barn in the failing light, unhitched the horses, worked through the evening routine of feeding and checking and settling, and went inside to the kitchen table where the yellow legal pad waited. The money from the fair totaled $206. Combined with what remained after the bank payment, the farm had ended its first full season of horse cultivation with $417 in surplus, enough to carry through the winter with margin, to purchase the seed stock she had already ordered, to pay Thomas and Earl their wages for the spring planting she had already asked them to come back for. She wrote the number down. She looked at it for a long time. The knock came 11 days later, well past dark, when she had been in bed for an hour but not asleep, the mind still running the season's calculations, the way a working mind does when it has been in motion for months and does not have a clean way to stop. She heard it twice before she was certain it was real, put on her coat over her nightclothes, lit the lamp, went to the door. Ob Marsh stood on the porch step with a lantern and a canvas bag. The lantern was held low, throwing his face into an arrangement of shadows, but the way he was standing, not at ease, not at his fence-line authority, but with the particular discomfort of a person who has put themselves in a position they would not have predicted for themselves, was clear enough. The bag held $55 in bills and coin. He wanted to buy grain barley for his horses, he said, good winter feed, the kind she was growing. He named a price that was market rate. He did not negotiate. Willa looked at the bag, then at him. Something in her recognized that this transaction was not primarily about grain, that the $55 and the late arrival and the careful avoidance of her eyes were all parts of a language she was not supposed to translate out loud, that doing so would cost him more than the interaction could bear. "I have barley set aside," she said. "Come around to the barn." She took the lamp. He followed with his lantern. In the barn, Brutus lifted his head from the hay and regarded Ob Marsh with the calm patience of a horse that has decided on some equine basis that this particular person presents no difficulty. Ob looked at the horse for a long moment. Willa scooped grain into burlap from the storage bin. "He's the Prentice horse," Ob said. Not a question. He had known Eli Prentice. He is. Ob was quiet for a moment, watching Brutus eat. Ellie Prentice was a good farmer, one of the best this county had. He said it without looking at her, his eyes on the horse. We all thought it was a shame when his boys sold the animals. Said it was necessary, I suppose it was. He paused. Things that are necessary aren't always right. Willa handed him the grain sack. He paid without counting the money onto her hand, just set it in her palm and closed her fingers around it with one rough gesture that was neither gentle nor harsh, and walked out of the barn into the night with the grain sack over one shoulder and his lantern swinging low. She stood in the barn for a minute after he was gone, the $55 in her hand, listening to the sound of his wagon moving away down Red Wing Road until she could not hear it anymore. November came with a sustained cold that turned the fields hard and silver, the ground contracting into itself the way Kansas ground does in winter, consolidating what it had accumulated across the growing months, going quiet and dense. Professor Whitfield came on the 8th of November with 2 graduate students and a collection of soil sampling equipment that filled most of his wagon. He spent 4 hours in the fields. Taking core samples at intervals, he mapped with methodical precision, labeling each one in the cramped handwriting she recognized from his notebook. He came back to the farmhouse afterward and sat at her kitchen table and spread his maps across the surface with the urgency of a man who has been thinking about a problem for weeks and has finally found the location where the thinking and the evidence meet. The east section organic matter is 3 times the county average, he said, putting his finger on a point in the map. The boundary between your east and west sections is visible in the samples. I can tell exactly where Warren Stout grazed his horses without you telling me, because the chemistry changes at the boundary. He looked up. This doesn't happen in one season. This is 40 years of accumulated practice made visible in the soil. Willa set 2 cups of coffee on the table. My grandfather believed the ground kept a record. Your grandfather was empirically correct. Whitfield wrapped his hands around the cup. The worked sections from this past season are already showing a measurable difference from the unworked boundary areas. In 5 years, the divergence will be significant. In 10, it will be what your east section is now. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his maps. I want to write about this. With your permission, the Agricultural College has been advocating for chemical soil amendments for 20 years. The results I'm seeing here complicate that narrative substantially. Willa gave him permission. She told him she wanted to see the paper before it was published, not to approve it, but to correct any errors of fact about the farm's methods. He agreed immediately, in the way of a scientist who has discovered that the person who knows the most about his subject is sitting across the table from him. He left in the early afternoon. His graduate students had not spoken during the kitchen visit, had simply observed the exchange with the careful attention of people understanding that they were present for a conversation that would matter later. A letter arrived from the Wichita Daily Eagle in the 3rd week of November, following the brief piece that had appeared there in September. The editor had received inquiries from readers about the Stout Farm article and wanted to send a writer for a longer feature. Willa wrote back that she was willing to speak with a writer. She named a date in early December, before the weather made the farm inaccessible, and described what the writer would and would not be permitted to photograph. The writer arrived on the appointed day, a young man named Aldous Peck, who wore city shoes inappropriate for the weather and took more notes than she expected. He walked the fields with her in the cold, asking questions that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. She answered the practical ones directly. On the philosophical ones, she was more careful, understanding that what she said would be printed, and that printed words had a way of becoming simplified in the transfer. When he asked what she wanted people to understand about what she had done, she thought for a moment before answering. That slow isn't what people think it is. She was looking at the frozen oat stubble when she said it, not at him. My great-grandfather wrote that in 1848, and it took me until this year to understand what he meant. Slow isn't the opposite of successful. Sometimes slow is how you build the thing that lasts past you. Peck wrote it down. She could see him underlining it. Thomas and Earl came back in December, not for field work, but to confirm the spring arrangement, to spend an afternoon learning the harness system from Agnes, who had agreed to come one December Tuesday for the purpose, and to spend time with Duchess, who had become a different horse than the one they had harvested alongside in August. She moved with an ease that had not been there before, a settled competence that the work had given her. Agnes arrived with 2 things: the technical agenda she had prepared for the harness session, and a loaf of bread that she set on the kitchen counter without comment, the same way she sometimes left extra biscuits at the eating house, as a statement rather than an offering. She watched Thomas and Earl work through the harness fitting with the same quality of attention she brought to watching Willa, concentrated, without praise for things done correctly, a single quiet word for things done wrong. By the end of the afternoon, both men could hitch Duchess with competence, which Agnes indicated by saying, again, 3 fewer times than she had said it at the beginning. When they were done, Thomas and Earl went to the barn to put the harness back in order, and Agnes sat at the kitchen table with the stillness of a woman who had decided to be somewhere rather than simply pausing on the way to somewhere else. Willa put coffee in front of her. Agnes turned the cup in her hands for a moment. Ely spent 40 years trying to show people what the ground was telling him, she said finally. Nobody wanted to hear it while he was alive to say it. It took someone willing to listen to the right trouble before the right knowledge could do any good. She looked at Willa across the table with an expression that required no elaboration from either of them. The snow came on the first day of December, arriving in the deliberate way of a first snow that means to establish itself rather than merely gesture toward winter. By evening, it covered the fields evenly, the oat stubble and the clover cover crop and the cleared sections and the boundary rows, everything leveled under the same white. Willa went out to the barn for the last check of the evening, her boots making the first marks in the new snow, the cold clear and specific around her face. She took her time with the feeding, with the water, with the check of Brutus's leg that had become reflexive. The joint was cool, he was comfortable. He stood in the lamplight with the patience of a horse that has earned its winter rest. She stood with her hand on his neck for a long time, listening to the barn around her. The horses breathing, the hay shifting, the particular acoustic quality of a well-built structure, holding warmth against the cold outside. Clement had built it in 1861 with hands that understood what they were building. Warren had kept it with the same understanding. Edgar had stored his machine in it and stopped listening to what it contained. She went back to the kitchen, sat at the table, and opened the last of Clement Stout's journals to the final blank page at the back. She picked up the pencil. She wrote 40 acres, 2 horses, 4 hives, debt, spring 65 acres. She looked at the page for a moment, then added a line below it, the ground improves. She closed the journal and left it on the table for morning. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Stout Farm in the windless dark, covering the fields where the clover was already rooted in for spring, covering the boundary lines between what had been and what was coming, covering everything equally with the patient impartiality of a season that does not distinguish between what has been lost and what has been built, only between what is here and what must wait until the ground is ready. The horses shifted in their stalls. The lamp burned low. The farm held its silence the way the farm had always held its silence, not as absence but as the sound of something ongoing, something that did not require the light to continue.